If we could get our seats, if we could get back. I know it's a great chance to talk to one another. If I could get everybody to take their seats, please. Wow, that stimulated some conversation. The texting onto the screen was just a small sliver of what was going on in people's minds, obviously. So I'd like to welcome you back to the session, and it's a pleasure to introduce our next panel, Experiences and Challenges of Implementing AI in Healthcare. And we're fortunate today to have Dr. Brian Hodges, MD, PhD, Professor, Faculty of Medicine at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, University of Toronto, and our Chief Medical Officer now at the University Health Network. Brian Hodges has a fantastic history in healthcare education and has contributed significantly, and I'm sure he'll do a fantastic job in leading this panel. Dr. Hodges.
Thank you, David. Welcome back. I thought that was a terrific keynote and a great panel, and we're all rewriting our talk. You know, as good presenters and educators, we're being adaptable. This panel is different. This panel is on the experience and challenges of implementing AI in healthcare. Now, James Bateman in the last panel said there are sticky issues when you bring it into the real world. So I want you to know that I'm from the real world. And our panelists have all been tasked to talk about how do you go from the theoretical, the ideal, the experimental into the very messy real world. And I'm not going to say very much because we want to hear from these folks, and we'll introduce them in a minute. But I wanted to just tell you how I think about it. So it's true, I've been Chief Medical Officer for 2 days now. But I've been in charge of education for many, many years. And my go-to source for technology is the movie Hidden Figures. And that's for how many of you have seen the movie Hidden Figures? Okay, there's 2 really good reasons why, and they both came up this morning. The first one is Hidden Figures is what happens when you put technologies into a real social context that has issues of equity and power and human relations. And of course, it's about the long-delayed story of telling about the African-American women who were brilliant and who did wonderful things. And I think you touched on it in the last panel in a brilliant way. And I do want us to think that one of the most interesting and important qualities of the messy real world is there are challenges and problems and inequities, and I think Heather touched on this very well. So books like Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Noble and Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks are critical for us to understand. As the point was made, this is not new. We've had awful problems of diagnostic inequities and things in healthcare forever. So the question is, will we augment that? Will we make it worse, or can we facilitate? So that's number one. And the second reason I love Hidden Figures is because I'm an educator. If you remember the movie, there were 3 brilliant women. One was a scientist, genius. Many of you in the room are probably very much like her, inventing the next Nobel Prize, Gardner Prize. The second one was a woman who was really an advocate. She was the one who said to a judge, "Don't you want to be the first judge in America to help the first black woman get into engineering school?" But the character I love is called Dorothy Vaughan. And I've done a little bit of work. I think we're at the Dorothy Vaughan moment. And if you remember what she did, she was also brilliant, but she was the woman who snuck in the night, saw them installing the IBM, read the manual of the IBM, and realized her whole department of human computers would be made obsolete very quickly. And she, out of generosity, retrained them all as computer programmers. I really think in healthcare we're at the IBM moment, we're at the Dorothy Vaughan moment. And so for those of us in the field that are not geniuses, not technical, not inventing anything, we have a role to play because we need to help our colleagues who will never be that interested in technology probably prepare for the new world. So the other challenge I'm putting to the panel is to be very frank with us and blunt about some of the challenges that may remove some of the AI is a bit of a sparkly object. And for people who love it, when it hits the real environment, there will be people that will not necessarily think it's the greatest thing. And we have to think about how they understand, how they adopt it, and how we effectively help them do that. So to do this, we're going to hear from 4 really interesting people with very different perspectives. The way this panel is organized, a little similar, a bit shorter. We're going to have them each present sort of 3 to 5, I think Richard might be 7 minutes on the area from their perspective. Then I'll ask them a few programmed pointed questions, and then we'll have some discussion. So I'm really pleased to start with Dr. Richard Reznick, who's a colleague and an old friend and is the Dean of Medicine, Dean of Health Sciences at Queen's University in Kingston, and was formerly here as our Chief of Surgery and our Vice President Medical Education. So Richard.
Thanks, Brian. As Brian mentioned, I'm a colorectal surgeon by training, which gives me a lot of credibility in giving a talk on AI, almost as much as being a dean of a health science faculty. But I have been asked by our Royal College to chair a task force on the implications of AI and emerging digital technologies for medical specialties. And the Royal College oversees approximately 45,000 specialists in the country. Broadly speaking, the task force is going to take a very serious look at the implications of AI and digital technologies for not only how we train future specialists, but also for those 45 specialists in practice and how they're going to have to adapt. And I think everyone would agree there's a lot of adaptation to do. Because the sea change that's happening, I think, is extremely real. Many of you live in it day to day. Those of us maybe closer to the healthcare coalface don't necessarily. And you know, when I think about the magnitude of the change, I think about Harari's book, *Sapiens*, and you know, he briefly reviews the major revolutions of mankind. 70,000 years ago, the cognitive revolution; 10,000 years ago, the agricultural; and 500 years ago, the industrial revolution. Well, it's unbelievable how exciting, how unbelievably privileged we're living through what may very well be classified as the fourth revolution of mankind. And I don't think that's really an overstatement. But certainly it doesn't mean that to embrace all these changes is going to be easy. And I guess from my point of view, there's 4 central questions that I'm thinking of from the task force perspective, but also that of someone's in charge of an educational institution. And the first, and I guess most pressing, and everybody gets focused on, is are doctors going to be replaced by AI? And of course, that's not a dichotomous question. And of course the answer is no, but it really comes with a huge big asterisk because it's not a clear-cut answer. I think as AI becomes a larger component of healthcare, our practitioners are very much going to have to do things differently. And maybe AI won't replace medical practitioners, but it'll certainly force them to evolve. And you know, we all know the stories of the data that exists already, that AI machines may be better than radiologists, may be better than dermatologists. There's applications that I'm sure we'll hear about, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these specialties, of course, are going to disappear. I can't imagine a day where we won't be having radiologic colleagues working alongside of dermatologists, working alongside of other specialists. But the changes are going to be profound. I was a colorectal surgeon for 25 years. Biggest part of my practice was taking out colon cancer. There's no way that a surgeon in 50 years is going to be taking out a colon the way I did it, without assistance of a machine. There's zero way, and it's likely not going to be 50 years. It may well be 30 years or 20 years or 10 years from now, just the same way as you won't be driving down the 401 in 50 years. But it's worth noting that AI has already had great strides, and it's worth reflecting that the acceleration won't be like any other technology of the last generation, which have by and large been linear. The power of data puts us on an exponential curve that's very different from the linearity of previous developments. But for all AI has to promise, I think we have to understand that AI may be able to remove a colon cancer, but the machine's not going to be able to show compassion or pick up on the social cues or emotions that a surgeon can. You know, being a surgeon is an unbelievable privilege, right? A person tells you, put me to sleep, take over my body. In very private moments, they bare their souls. That's difficult to understand how a machine might receive that information about bearing one's soul. So, you know, when you give a diagnosis of colon cancer, you tell a husband and a father that he has cancer. You're not telling him about some information. You're telling him about treatment plans and life expectancy, but you're also watching the tear on his wife's cheek, the concerned look on his daughter's face, and you're figuring out how to give the diagnosis in a very nuanced way that's different with every single patient. AI's come a long way, but I think we'll struggle with understanding emotions and showing compassion at the level that we're talking about, at the level that you and I do every day. And so one of the major obstacles of integrating AI into healthcare then will be just this nuance of the issue of compassion and the interface. But it'll also make us more efficient. And Topol, in his wonderful review for the NHS on AI in healthcare, talks about the gift of time. And I honestly think that that's maybe one of the most profound effects, that doctors' work life is going to be very different in an era of AI. The second question in medical education we have to ask is who we're going to accept into the medical profession. And what are we going to teach them, right? So right now, it's a crazy world out there. Queens gets 5,000 applications into medical school, and we really don't look for, we basically, the kids who get in are kids who've 4.0, they've aced their MCATs like crazy, and they've done a whole bunch of other things. But we say we're looking for innovation and creativity, but we're really not. We don't have a way of understanding who's going to be able to cope with disruption, who has entrepreneurial spirit. Those aren't constructs that we really, but they're needed constructs, I think, in an era and a generation of AI. The third question, and somewhat related to that, to the second, is what about our curricula, both in medical education and residency, and also for ongoing practitioners. So we're absolutely going to have to put a lot of information about AI and understanding data science into the curriculum, which we don't now. Medical schools are going to have to evolve fairly radically because most of what we teach now can be flipped and it will be delivered digitally. And so we have to reimagine the way we're delivering medical education. The whole knowledge component, the paradigm for giving that has changed. You know, from memorizing textbooks to being available on your cell phone in an integrated way and on a minute's notice. And the final and maybe most profound question is, we have 45,000 specialists out there. They've been doing things, for many of them, for 20 or 30 years in a certain way. And how are we going to get them to adapt and change? And that may be the most profound challenge. It'll create some interconnected challenges. How are we going to deal with the cost of upgrading? How are we going to ensure that everybody feels comfortable in a new role, taking on new responsibilities? How will we make sure that everyone has access to retraining? And how will we make sure that those who need to be retrained and want to be retrained can be retrained? And Topol speaks quite broadly about these concerns in his report. And we need to make things very accessible, and we need to deliver education in a very different way. You know, the whole notion of standing up in front of a classroom for an hour with slides is going to disappear, and we have to be prepared for that. So I'm very much looking forward to learning. That's going to be incredibly exciting over the course of the next while. Being a health care practitioner in today's society is not just a job. It's really a privilege. And with that privilege comes the need for an open mind to the exciting future that AI will bring to healthcare. Thanks for having me to the conference.
Many of us travel a great deal for our work, for academic work. In my suitcase, I have a huge bag full of plug adapters. This is a nightmare of technology, that there is hardly any interoperability between our electrical systems. We are creating an enormously complex new system called AI, and I'm really pleased to welcome next Marta Janczarski from Standards Council of Canada, who's the sector specialist in this area, to talk to us about things related to that enormous challenge. Marta.
So this will be a little bit of a different perspective. I'm from Standards Council of Canada, and just before we get going, I will provide you with context about who we are and what we do, as we're quite small and maybe not as well known as our counterparts abroad. So we're actually a Crown corporation. We're arm's length from Parliament, and we report directly to them since 1971, and we have three main facets that we operate with. We don't develop the standards, but we accredit the organizations that develop national standards. So some organizations that might be quite familiar to you are some such as CSA, UL, ASTM, HSO, formerly Accreditation Canada. So we go through the audit process to make sure that the standards that they develop are rigorous enough, are created through consensus, matrix balanced teams, and go through a review process regularly, 3 to 5 years, to be able to be considered national standards. Our second pillar is the membership to the international standards organizations. So the two most well-known are ISO and IEC, as well as the joint one in the middle for IT, which is called JTC1. So we provide membership for all Canadians to free of charge, participate in the MIR committees on topics from adapters to HTML, to plumbing, to X-ray, to medical devices, and most recently, as of last year, AI. My pillar with SCC really works with Canadians and Canadian innovators to help leverage standardization, not as just something that we most often look at as certification and really close to standards and something that you just need to get through, but actually be able to participate on the development of standards. Being able to be part of these tables and really realize the impact that they can give internationally, but also the information that they can leverage to be able to make sure that they have market access and market adoption. So quite briefly, where are the standards used? We have ISO standards. I'm sure you're quite familiar, especially for work with medical devices. There's quite a few of them that are used quite regularly for licensing. So absolutely, regulators do use standards quite frequently. Sometimes it's as a requirement to be able to be proved. Sometimes it's used as reference for guidance. Sometimes it's as simple as using the terminology. And making sure that the terminology of how they define the objects in regulations are consistent and harmonized internationally. However, there's also an aspect of procurement, and especially internationally around EU and in the US, procurement bids are more and more often using standards to reference what the requirements they need in a very simple way. And this really helps innovators because instead of using very unique and sometimes quite laborious procurement bids that they need to reply to, they can really optimize their applications to be able to use one standard to apply to very many procurement bids. I work with Canadian innovators in both the health tech and as well as the AI and big data space to be able to work with them to understand how, through business development, using and leveraging standardization can actually help to reduce some of these barriers, to be able to influence sometimes in a completely different manner regulations, and be able to have a subject matter-based conversation with sometimes very tough competitors. This is incredibly critical in a very new emerging area such as AI. You've brought up a fantastic example in adapters, and sometimes where standardization would have really, really helped. And we have this fantastic opportunity where silos yet aren't formed, but there's that risk of them being formed. And when you look at something that's so revolutionary, and you brought up my previous speaker, a fantastic example of, for example, the Industrial Revolution, and where there's something that's so ubiquitous across industries, standards can really be that tie-in that help it move forward. And something as simple as railway ties, and the standardization of their size could really help move forward an entire new area of commerce. So I wanted to speak around some of the new initiatives that are going around internationally and really hope to speak to some of the innovators here in the room as an opportunity to become engaged and to be able to leverage the Canadian leadership that's so prominent in Toronto and Canada around AI and the applications in healthcare to that to these international tables. So one of them is IEEE, which you may be familiar with, and is tackling the aspects of ethical AI and societal concerns. The first panel talked really about the social license and some of the main critical topics around that. And these are areas that can have standards that really help to guide those conversations and help to have a clear consensus on some of them. It doesn't mean that this is going to solve all issues, but it helps to have those guiding documents that you can specialize to, for example, applications in healthcare. Another organization is called ITU, and they've recently partnered with the WHO to form a focus group around AI in healthcare standards. So this group is very specifically looking at how the applications of AI in healthcare need to have interoperability, need to have that transparency, that robustness, and really develop standards that are explicitly going to address those application issues. And as a all-encompassing committee, it's what I've previously mentioned is the JTC1, which is the joint committee between ISO and IEC, focusing on all IT topics. This was established last year. There are 22 international countries participating, 8 observing. It really is a worldwide table. And Canada has been participating since its creation last year with its own mirror committee. And my understanding is actually the chair of this committee is here in the room, Frank Hodges from Vector Institute. And we have a really good matrix of startups, of scale-ups, of researchers, and hopefully some of yourselves that could tackle issues such as trustworthiness. There's a working group devoted around risk management in AI, around the robustness. What is the terminology of these? What do the definitions mean? Some of the computational assessments and statistical models. So we can get very technical in some of these standards, and we can get very broad spectrum ones, as well as use cases and applications and the societal concerns. ISO has partnered with the UN to look at the Sustainable Development Goals around how AI is going to shape society in the future. And JTC1 is working around standards for use case and applications, so healthcare included, to be able to really understand the far wide-reaching impact of what kind of lies ahead. So hopefully I can, through these conversations, really change the conversation and change the focus from standards, not really how to certify and sort of how to use them once they're published, because that's when the benchmark is set. And it'd be a real big shame as AI industry in Canada takes a leadership role internationally for this not to be reflected by the international tables that set standards that will be the benchmarks and possibly the barriers for Canadian leadership in the future if they're not part of that conversation. Thank you very much.
Terrific and very practical angle. When a new technology comes into practice, we know from the literature that the most valuable people are those that can see both sides. And the next speaker, Dr. Tom Purdie, lives in both worlds. He's an inventor. He's invented and worked on a team that's built AI systems that are in use at Princess Margaret Hospital, but he's also a physicist, which means he's involved in a team that cares for patients. So I'm very pleased to welcome Tom as our next speaker.
I'm not doing email. I just made a big post, hopefully. So I'd like to thank the organizers for having me speak in this session. The previous talks and panel were great. Actually, none of this is working. But I also wanted to say I'm in this obstacle session, but really I think when you have obstacles, you have opportunity, right? So here's another shout out. We have a poster, come to poster 11. See some of the stuff we're doing where that weren't an obstacle. I think we actually did something good. And when I knew I was doing this, I polled all these smart people that I work with. So if I say something that you don't like, it's probably from them, and all the stuff you like is from me. If I don't get to everything, here is a list of what I want to talk about, and I'll do it really quick. And I'm not listening to what Brian gave me for instructions. I actually am more asking questions and providing you with answers, so maybe this will facilitate this discussion. So data is a big thing, data bias, data portability, and feature creep considerations. So Rich did a great job of this in the first session. I won't talk about that at all. Something that hasn't really been talked about is regulatory. We did talk about privacy, security, and I think these are things that can easily be solved. So again, I don't see this as being ultimately obstacles, but I think what we're talking about, especially in the first session, the first panel, sorry, was about data and people giving up their data, and they do this all the time, Instagram, Gmail, Google Maps. So will people go to Facebook Hospital for better, cheaper care, and are they happy just to give up their data for that? So I think maybe we're getting to the point where all these big tech companies can actually just buy hospitals en masse, and if they decide to do that, what does that mean? So actually, that was a question. Okay, so what the big point, I think, of what I want to bring up was the changing roles of AI in healthcare. And so do hospitals want to be AI dev shops, or should they be offloading some of those things to someone else, maybe someone like a commercial entity, or would they rather do this in-house? Now, clearly, there are some advantages to doing it in-house, but there are also some problems. And so the obstacle, I think, is people who are in a position of being able to decide these things need to make that clear for how healthcare is going to move forward, and I think that's very important. So basically, as I think I said, what do hospitals want to be when they grow up? Do they want to be a dev shop, or do they want to be relying on technology that they help develop that's coming back to treat their patients better? So interestingly, and this came up with James. So James, and I think this highlights, not to point specifically James out, but this is, I think, going to be a very interesting phenomenon moving forward, is who's going to work at hospitals and universities. So James is doing a PhD, and he's on a track. A lot of people here are MDs or PhDs, and he wanted to leave. Are you going back to do your PhD? Maybe. So that's the worst answer, right? Because James is not going back to do his PhD probably, because there's so many opportunities to do some cool stuff, not at doing a PhD, which is, maybe you could recommend or maybe you can't. People have ideas, and now there's the opportunities to do them without having to use the normal framework. So who's going to be teaching our med students? Who's going to be teaching our grad students, right? So this is a problem I think we need to, or has to be addressed. So maybe this is an obstacle for how hospitals work in the future. And something a little bit more provocative, and so I've actually mentioned this too in a clinical trials group, and so this didn't actually go over so well, but in the space of AI is hypothesis-driven research coming to an end. So we have this idea where I have data, I don't really need to have this, is this the cause of this or backwards? Should I just send all the data and let some system tell me what is going to happen? And so I don't know. Like, I think this might be something that we also need to address as being in the hospital. Where do we draw that fine line between who is making hypotheses and who is just sending data to get some results? And then this also goes into the clinical trial space, which I said where is maybe clinical trials, are they going to be dated? So maybe not for drug discovery, like preliminary drug discovery, but in other cases, there's a lot of limitations to clinical trials, and they're extremely expensive. So maybe AI is a more efficient, better way to do this and get us a more well-rounded data set than basically trying to vary very few parameters in a study. Okay, so the last part I want to talk about, and this is something we've been really talking about, come to poster 11, is AI in humans. And so again, these are all just questions. So can AI be trusted? And if so, that's great. But if it does something wrong, can it be forgiven? And what is the model for forgiving AI? And also, what are the implications for physicians, for example, who are doing care relying on AI, and where does that legality fall? I don't want to get into that, although just to raise the point that I think someone needs to really figure this out because it's uncharted territory in some way. And I also want to just talk about the idea that, maybe there's bugs in a model, and this is not necessarily the same as what Rich was talking about, but there's definitely ways that we might be able to learn and attack models, and how do we prevent that? And that, I think, will be a big problem or potential problem for people using AI day to day and being able to game the system to their advantage. Thank you.
Speaking of gaming the system to your advantage, when you tell an inventor you can't have slides, they figure out another way to have slides. Brilliant. Finally, but last but not least at all, Sally Daub is the founder and managing partner of Pool Global Partners. When people who are not in the field you're trying to change look at it from outside, they see, God, this is an inefficient system, we can fix that. But then you come in and you find that that's difficult, it's challenging, and it doesn't always do what you think it's going to do. So she's going to talk to us about that.
So I do approach this from a slightly different perspective. My background has been in building and tech companies in different industries. My first industry was a semiconductor area, and I noticed one of the other speakers talked earlier about the rate of change happening in AI not being linear and being much more aggressive. I actually disagree with that. If you look at a lot of other industries and how they've gone through major disruptions, they've actually happened on a very, very fast pace. So I think that there's a lot of value, and one of the things that I'm hearing is consistently looking at healthcare kind of as an insular organization. We're very, very different. We're harder than everybody else. Every industry is hard. Insurance is hard. The pay TV business is hard. Like, they're all difficult. They have rules, but they all went through major disruptions and changes that brought a lot of benefits, but a lot of changes in terms of how people had to do business. But I spent some of my career in that area, but I had the opportunity over the last 2 years to work as an advisor for a deep learning company out of San Francisco. And they were actually doing work around radiology images and applying deep learning that to drive efficiencies. To the fact that implementing AI in healthcare was difficult, because what we were trying to do is take some novel technology and try to get sort of the existing organization somehow to adopt it. My experience has been, in almost every industry, disruption doesn't come from inside. It comes from outside, other organizations, things where you don't even expect that it might happen. There was another things that I actually got to experience, got to travel around the world, saw healthcare, obviously down the US, in Japan, China, a number of other jurisdictions. And one thing that I think the room needs to consider, it's a race, and the borders are going away. There's no reason why our models of the future couldn't be from China. So the question is when we look at Ontario and being a leader in AI healthcare, you are competing with the rest of the world. And the question is, are you going to be able to move fast enough so we don't just become the research and the tools and kind of the people that kind of thought about AI, but are we going to be the ones that are actually implementing real world solutions that Ontario residents, the technical teams, all the healthcare professionals can benefit from and be leaders in? I think that there are some major changes happening. One is the whole idea that I don't think borders are going to stop people from where they get health care. I also don't talk about patients, I talk about consumers. And we're seeing a lot of direct-to healthcare online applications. If I need a drug for birth control now, that's how the millennials are going to get it. And I do think millennials are causing a major shift in how they expect to see it, and they will drive capital, influx of money, and development of products to change it so that they get the healthcare now and when they want to have it. And they're probably going to be the ones making decisions on a lot of how the boomers are going to be being treated as they get older too. So there's somebody to really watch and see how we can change. So those are some of the things that I'd like to kind of put out there. The one other thing that I think is really interesting, the last speaker, I call them Blue Lava, but you've changed the company name, spent a bit of time with them and was traveling around the world, and was really interesting to learn was Princess Margaret has a worldwide reputation. Like, the idea that we could develop models and market them to the world coming out of these organizations, we could build huge products that would benefit all of us, drive money into the economy, make sure our patients are the best taken care of. Or we could be literally buying product from China. And that's really what I actually see. So those are my comments.
I hope you appreciate the brain power and the diversity of perspectives here, which is really what we need to think about implementation. So I have some questions for them. We'll get them started, and then we'll take some questions from you. So in reverse order, you've heard that there's a time element to this. We don't have forever. You've heard that we have to decide what we want to be when we grow up in healthcare. You've heard that we better do it with some common standards and some agreement so we can move forward without a million new silos. And you've heard that we have to reinvent the education system. Okay, folks, so here's the problem. Healthcare, while we're great at the undergraduate level, the MD program, the nursing program, these are fabulous. And of course, everyone's reflex will be to stuff more into the 3 or 4 years of undergraduate. The reality is, when you get out and get your certificate, there's nothing for you. There's the odd weekend course in Orlando. There's a little bit of continuing education. We don't do much in the hospitals or even the schools. So we have almost no system. There's no Dorothy Vaughan system. So my question to you first is, what can we do? And I'm going to jump right off, I think, Sally's, we better hurry up. We cannot wait for an entire new generation of people to come out with shiny new degrees and diplomas. That will help. But some of us are going to be around. I'm pretty old, and I'll still be working for another few decades, I hope. So what are we going to do to prepare the environment or in the organizations we're going into, where I would say 90% of people have no idea what you're talking about? Who would like to start?
Yeah. Well, I'll start. It was really funny because I was in an Uber car, and we were talking about that, but the kid driving just got into med school. And by the time he had dropped me off, I'd really literally scared the crap out of him because this is a young kid, and he was like, you know, I've got into med school, I've got this, and this is how it's going to go. And I was talking about all the technology that's coming. So one way to get people to go a little bit is, like this organization, the conversations, is to scare people a bit, because then they will start to participate. AI is complicated, but it's not that complicated. And I think there's a role for everybody in the room to start to understand how they can start to look at taking technology, whether it's AI or otherwise, and implement it and start to embrace it in their organizations.
Great, thank you. Who else wants to jump on that? Richard.
Well, I'm going to say something that's totally practical, which is terrible, but a lot of this will be about how we restructure, if we can restructure, compensation at the end of the day in the workplace, particularly in the physician workplace. Our current compensation mechanisms don't have anything built in for retraining, for ongoing maintenance of competence. It's all done off the side of the desk. It's not part of our common workplace. And I think if what today is teaching us, if anything, it's that in a rapidly changing world, we have to have adaptability of our workforce. We have to bake into the systems, and that means the compensation systems elements that will allow for that.
I mean, that's so interesting when you think about, we're just here talking about a technology, right? But reworking the financial remuneration system, it's one of those implementation science pieces that would be invisible in the front. That's a great answer. Do the other two want to make a comment about this? Learning, adapting?
So I thought Rich's talk, the first talk was great because it did highlight where there's still a place. I mean, as much as the stuff we're building, actually, I'm really trying to replace my job, like completely automate everything I do. I still ultimately want a job at the end, maybe, but I do think there is a place, and I know Brian and I and David had been talking about this with some other people about what's the impact, especially in radiation oncology space. And what I was hearing, which I thought was very interesting, was should I learn how to code? To address the fear of me losing my job in AI, which I think is maybe a little bit misguided. I don't think everyone needs to be able to code to contribute to AI. And if you look at like the work that Rich is doing, how do you even compete with that when you have a degree not in computer science, or you're just picking this up? So I think there's a place. I think we just need to figure out what that space is.
I think this is a great challenge, because some of the early work that I've seen says that the competencies are not coding. They're things like metacognition, like human-machine interaction, dealing with things like tech rage that emerge when machine failure happens. So these are really important competencies, none of which are taught in undergrad or in continuing education. Okay, so Marta has posed a real challenge for us. I feel a sense of emergency around this. Every technology that ever gets invented, I just have to keep going to buy new plugs and new adapters, and this is going to be a complete EPRs. Nothing works with anything else. So you've argued well that we're at a moment where we could create silos. Healthcare does not have a good reputation for working with everybody else. So I think there are people other than healthcare people probably working on AI right now. So Marta, maybe you could start us, and I'm interested in the others, on how do we work toward interoperability? I'm guessing the finance department's going to have AI, and it's probably going to come from banking more than it's going to come from Princess Margaret. And I'm guessing there'll be AI in the HR department, and I'm guessing it's going to be all over the place. So how do we have a conversation that these sectors and systems talk to each other?
Sure. Actually, it's a really good point because AI is developing uniquely in whatever industry. And in Canada, agriculture is a staple industry for us. And they've had incredible innovations around the use of very big data to be able to really optimize agriculture output, and especially in a time of climate change. And something that on first glance is completely unrelated to healthcare. But there are experts that are developing these abilities to analyze these big data models, to especially working around forecasting and looking at how do you tackle bias there, where the results may only maybe realize at the end of a season when it's too late. When you start looking at it that way, there are some common ground. And what's really nice is that you have these experts from all these different fields sitting around a table, around a big data standard, looking at the risk management, for example, of metadata analysis. And you can have a very productive conversation with all these different perspectives. I think the importance is that we have to make sure that healthcare isn't missing, because right now, if I'm being frank, they're in the minority.
Okay.
And so we have fintech, we have agriculture. Healthcare is there as an obvious one, but in terms of representation of expertise, it would be great, and especially on the Canadian front. And just to actually mention, because you've mentioned China, there is a direct correlation in the success that China has had globally with their economy, in their participation and proposals of standards on the international front. It has been overwhelming in some cases.
So we talk endlessly about collaboration in healthcare, but I'm hearing we're not that visible at the table. And how many of you are collaborating with someone in agriculture? So our Standards Canada person is challenging us to collaborate better. Let's hear from you. So I would love to hear from the room questions for any of these panelists or anybody that wants to ask about how we think about the implementation of AI in the healthcare field. Yes, Dr. Rubin. You'll have to really wave at me. It's blinding up here, but Dr. Barry Rubin from the Peter Munn Cardiac Center.
Thanks very much. Fantastic discussion. Tom, I actually posted this as a question. If you want to start participating in using AI, is it best to bring AI experts into the hospital environment, or is it best to outsource that activity? And embedded in my question is the realization of what it costs to bring these people in and the resources to build a team internally versus outsource. Really interested in your opinion on this.
Microphone, sir.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's very complicated in the sense that, and I alluded to this a little bit. We're really competing with big tech companies in trying to attract talent. And so if you're always thinking, and maybe Sally would appreciate this, when you're looking at a company, you're looking at the talent, like what they offer. And if we're losing the talent or to companies, if that's the best way, then maybe that is the solution. If we can get talent in and make it stay, then I think that's a good option. But I think that's going to be difficult. I guess time will tell whether or not that's a viable option for people and whether or not they see it as attractive. We do have all these people at universities now taking up positions at big tech companies. So how do you stop that, or how do you prevent that, or how do you make it attractive for them to work? So I didn't answer your question, but
Sally, you're poaching all our best talent.
Yeah.
What do you want to answer?
Well, I'd have two comments to that. I think you have to have some expertise in, but again, I think it's really hard to get some fundamental disruptions in products out just internally. So I think in my experience, this isn't just in healthcare, it's in a lot of industries. It's better to get some external, but I do think that the hospitals and healthcare need to develop some kind of AI capability. But I think you guys, or we should look at AI and the tools and the expertise around that, kind of literally what web designers were like in the late 1990s. And the data scientists aren't going to like this, but the tools are going to become easier and easier for all of you to use very, very quickly. And you're not going to have to hire really, really expensive data scientists for you to be able to go on and creatively look at the data and start to do models. And companies are coming up with more and more sophisticated tools that make it easier and easier for a lot more regular people to use. And so I think you should anticipate that in going forward. And then there are other challenges, how you store the data, how you get the data. I actually think security is a bigger issue that people actually aren't focused on. And they think, the cloud is less secure, maybe keeping it on premise. I think the premise is actually more insecure. But as you start to use this data and other people have it, I don't think we have really good systems to understand how we're going to de-identify that data, transfer that data, and get people to get access so that they can actually drive their AI models on themselves and do research. And so that's how I kind of see the future moving.
Great. Who's next? David Jaffrey, I think. Wave at me like if you're next. Yeah, David. Yeah. Who's after David?
Yeah, the two comments maybe I get feedback on around education. So we used to have the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. But, it seems to me it's the 3 R's in ML now. And how early do people learn how? Because the idea that machine learning isn't outsourced from every individual to some group seems crazy to me. So how early are we driving machine learning as a competency into the process? And Google has what's they call auto ML now. Not only do they have automation and machine learning, they have a way to automate the choice of the ML for you. But that kind of a competency, that's one question. The other one is around it's not about the code, it's about the data. The machines code themselves practically now. So the coding is not so curious, it's the data. And the data in healthcare has to be tied to outcomes, or you don't get anything to predict. So, this is where the shift from inventing to curating becomes very powerful. So I'd love some feedback on how soon do we teach ML, and how do we make sure we get the outcomes?
Richard, you're in charge of a fantastic medical school, which I went to, and a whole bunch of other health sciences schools. What's the answer to David's question? Is it kindergarten? Where do we start teaching machine learning and how to work with these systems?
Well, for sure it'll be proximal to medical school. I'm quite confident of that. But as I was saying before, we need to restructure medical education that's going to develop the ability for our trainees to learn these technologies at very early stages. I was just on a recent sabbatical, and I went to visit DeepMind in London, and ran into a whole bunch of people. One of the people I ran into was a graduate from medical school at Stanford, and this was her first job. She graduated from Stanford, went into the work for DeepMind, that's owned by Google right now, and I thought that was a bit unusual. She said, no, a third of our class have not gone into clinical medicine. So it's just something to think about. There's a reorientation and a reframing. We all might have opinions about that and the merit of $1 million of medical education to prepare someone to go work for Google, but it's an interesting concept. I think medical education is going to change dramatically in the next few decades.
The second half of the question, Tom, I'm going to bunt at you. So UHN has a school, the Michener Institute of Education at UHN, and we actually have a new AI system. And I sometimes think that it would be nice to make Michener what I'd call a technological petting zoo, where we could have a Pepper robot and we could have various bits and pieces. But to your point, an AI system in the closet, not connected to any data, won't learn anything. It'll just be like taking a still photo of a heart and ask if it's beating. So you know these systems very well. How are we going to create education on real systems of AI that are actually learning if they're in schools and places that are not connected up to actual patient data sets?
So I guess that's a good question. So I'm familiar with the system you're talking about.
Yeah, I thought so.
So I think maybe one of the big advantages of AI is that there is the potential for portability in terms of how models are generated and how they could be transferred. And so that's a nice way to disseminate expertise across different centers, but then also have other centers have access to that expertise. And so, again, going back to I'll go back to Rich's the first talk today. I think some of the data and what is applicable can be figured out there in terms of how these are built, and then that could be pushed out. So, but I think the data from the hospital, like we're talking about, that could be done in concert with education, or it's going to have to be. Yeah.
My own bias, of course, if I'm allowed to answer something, is that all healthcare facilities need to become schools so that we can actually understand learning as part of the agenda we have when we're running a healthcare system or hospital. Next, yes. Oh, sorry, Peter. Well, there's time for both of you. How about we take this fellow first, and then Peter, you do the close. Is that okay?
I've asked a bunch of questions today.
Oh, don't fight over it. We're too long. Peter Rossos, go ahead.
Well, listen, thank you very much. Wonderful panel. I just have two very short questions directed at the panelists, and that is...
One
okay,
very
but they're
short
related.
question. Yeah.
So that is, how do we as humans better direct, the emergence of these technologies in healthcare? And Richard, we highly value your leadership on this national group. How does the panel view opportunities around addressing the quadruple aim? Enhancing the provider experience, et cetera, and productivity through the technology. And then Marta, getting back to Brian's challenge with EPR, can we look at AI as a new UI onto his clinical information system? Are you looking at that from a standards perspective as well?
Okay, we'll let you away with two questions.
Thank you.
Good questions, Peter. Great. So you got them both, and Marta, you did the other one? Yeah, okay. Richard
Well,
first.
I'm not sure I understood the first question, Peter. So could you just repeat it?
The quadruple aim in
aim.
terms of
Yeah.
enhancing the provider experience and productivity through these technologies. Is that on the agenda of the panel?
Well, we've only had one brief meeting, so we're creating our agenda. I would say intuitively the answer to that is yes, but we're just framing the big buckets. It's a huge amount of work, and we're going to have to be very focused if we're going to be in any way productive. Right now we're looking at what do we mean by the inputs. Which technologies are we talking about? Are we talking about robotics? Are we talking about AI? Are we talking about phenomics and proteomics? Other elements of data science, and then on the other side, what are the outputs? And for our task force, our main knitting is going to be training. The Royal College oversees the standards for the training of all specialists except for family physicians. And that's going to change radically, and that's where the main part of our focus is going to be.
Peter, I think implicit in your question is actually a rhetorical question and a caution that we need to make sure that as we adopt new technologies, we're thinking about the human impact on it and what it does to the lives of people using the technologies. Yes? Yes. So Marta, yes. Did you get the second question?
Yes, I
Good.
did.
Okay.
And the idea of having standards around clinical processes as opposed to products or performance measurements is definitely something that I think is being explored, and not even just in general around AI, but just the whole episode of care. And in Canada, there's an organization that is slowly working at developing standards as opposed to just best practices, guiding documents, and every hospital has their own. And HSO is really trying to look at that. And I think in Canada, they're that organization that's really trying to look at consensus-based peer-reviewed standards for that area. So I'm very curious to see how they will do.
Mm-hmm. So you do have time for your last question to you.
Great.
Yeah.
Just to comment really quickly, at NYU Langone, we've been investing in this internally for about 2.5 years now. And so I'm 100% certain that you should be doing this internally. And I'll tell you why. Because the one thing that outside companies have the most difficulty with is understanding the workflows and designing the best practice alerts or whatever need to come downstream, right? And every company that wants to work with us, that's what they want. They want, hey, can you guys figure out how physicians are going to use this information and what are they going to do at the point of care to actually translate these into clinical practice? And I don't think those are answers that can really come from the outside. Those have to come from the internal people doing their daily job, taking care of patients every day. And
Thank you very much. Last minute, I want 10 seconds each. If I was in this audience and I was not a technical person and AI was not my strong suit, but I'm very curious, what's the one thing that I could do to really help me advance my own knowledge and understanding of this field? Who wants to go first? Richard Reznick. One thing. Tom's first.
So I would say be open-minded for change,
Okay.
and embrace change. It's coming down the pike at a very rapid pace like we've never seen before, and resistance will be counterproductive.
Futile even. David. Tom.
I was going to say, talk to Siri or talk to Alexa.
Talk to Siri and talk to Alexa, but talk to them politely, right? Yeah. Sally?
I think to his point, to recognize that you're already using AI on a daily basis. And one thing we didn't talk about is I think that there's going to be a lot of sensationalizing through the media, not really giving a real honest reflection about the benefits of it. So trying to really understand how it's impacting your life now.
Great. Last word, Marta?
Yeah, I would reiterate it about how far we're actually already along, and really keeping an open mind as to the ubiquitousness of it and where and how wide spanning it is.
Great. I want to thank this panel for their amazingly frank comments and for helping me as a moderator stay on time and be succinct, and for you asking questions. Thank you very much. Can we thank you?